Okay, it's good to see everybody this morning. We are still moving through Matthew 24, but we should be able to finish it today, uh, considering what kind of discussions that we get into. So, but don't let that deter you. That I'm thinking, okay, we'll get through it. Don't let that stop you from making any comments or asking any questions, because that's what this is all about, making sure that we're able to get a proper understanding of what we're going through. So when we were together last time, we made it up to verse 28. Jesus, in discussing with his apostles, for wheresoever the carcass is, there will the eagles be gathered together. And we made connection to the fact that this is an overall discussion and context that was started at the beginning of this chapter with questions that the apostles had. The questions the apostles had were in connection with the fact of Jesus being taken to look at the temple, the buildings that were there, and then his prophetic statement, there would not be left one stone left upon another. And then leading the apostles to ask the question of, okay, what are the signs of when this is going to happen, and when it is that this is going to be a sign of your coming in this action. And thus he begins a discourse with them in discussion of that event, and he even simplifies it for us by the repetition of the phrase, what? As we're thinking about time stamps, events of the time.
Shortly come to pass.
What is it?
Shortly come to pass.
All right, shortly come to pass, but
The time is at hand.
not quite. Keep going.
Last days.
No.
This generation.
There you go. Yay! All these things shall come upon this generation. And thus, this is in that context. And we made connection to the fact that we've already heard this warning being given to the children of Israel, Matthew 23:38, which is really the introduction of what started this conversation, where he said, "Behold, your house is left unto you desolate." Speaking to the Jewish people, the temple of God at that time. Matthew 21:13, he had already given the announcement and said unto them, "It is written, my house shall be called the house of prayer, but you have made it a den of thieves." Thus the transformation has already taken place, already in a state of desolation. And we made connection back to Ezekiel chapter 10, that this also happened in the Old Testament. That in Ezekiel 10 describes the glory of God leaving the temple before Babylon laid siege. So what Jesus is giving to them is not anything new that they haven't heard before. All right, so moving on into new material, still in connection with everything that's transpired and what it is that he's discussed. And he says, immediately after the tribulation of those days shall the sun be darkened, the moon shall not give her light, the stars shall fall from heaven, the powers of heaven shall be shaken. Now again, you can find this similar language used throughout the Old Testament in discussion of, as it says, tribulation, which is that which is following after conquest. Isaiah, Jeremiah use similar language, in that when you're viewing what is transpiring and how that the apostles are raising the question, when is going to be the end of the world, this is just terrible, terrible stuff that's happening. And thus when we have individuals write about dark days in our history, our nation's history, they write about it in similar language. It's as though the sun doesn't even shine. Which, I mean, even if that matter, the Hobbit, aren't there different sections in the books and also in the movies where that type of language is used as they're on their travels, and they're discussing the dark days that are ahead and the difficulties that they're facing? It's the same type of material. Our nation is being destroyed. I mean, just think about it. If our country were overrun, we'd be looking at it like this. This is just dark. And it's going to be as though the sun is not shining. The moon shall not give her light. And that this is happening after those days. This is what's going to be like. Verse 30. Then shall appear the sign of the Son of Man in heaven, and then shall all the tribes of the earth mourn, and they shall see the Son of Man coming in the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. Mark also gives account of this but it's just very simply put, and then shall they see the Son of Man coming in the clouds with great power and glory. Now, Jesus here gives us information as to what this appearing and what this coming is all about. Then shall appear the sign of the Son of Man in heaven. So it's not his person, nor is it going to be him literally, but the sign can also be translated as a sign, a token, a wonder, a miraculous event. And again, he states, the sign of the Son of Man, which is in heaven, not on the earth. A lot of people get lost in these events, and they're thinking that this is all about Jesus coming back at the final time, and when he comes back at the final time, he's going to come to earth. There's no mention of him coming to earth here. The sign of the Son of Man in heaven. And even with that, when we're referencing how he is appearing and how it is that he's coming, and they shall see the Son of Man coming in the clouds of heaven with power, we're seeing the sign of him. So again, that's a token, not the actual thing. It's no different than as we're driving down the road, or let's say you're on a trip and you're headed for your hotel, and you get close to where your hotel is and you start seeing the sign for the hotel. You don't pull over there and spend the night, because that's not the actual thing. This is just the sign of the Son of Man. So when the Jewish nation fell, that was the sign that Jesus was exactly where he said he would be. We haven't gotten to his trial as of yet, but even as Jesus is standing before the high priest, Jesus makes reference to these events, that this is going to be the final sign that the high priest is going to see. And that when he sees this, then he will know that he's been glorified and that he sits at the right hand of power. These things are leading up to and a showing forth of the power of God and his establishment, or his taking of the kingdom from the Jews, as Jesus said in Matthew chapter 8, and giving it to a nation or giving it to a people that's going to bring forth fruit. It's no longer about these people, but now it's over here. So these things are happening not by chance. Jesus is prophesying to his apostles and to others. These things are happening on purpose. It's by design, and that for judgment. And that even with everything that is transpiring, the Jews had time so as to repent before this power was actually shown. The apostles going out and doing the teaching and preaching that they were doing, the evangelists like Philip and different ones that were involved in spreading of the kingdom, all of that is designed so as to help those that will not be deceived and those that will be willing to flee to recognize these things. So again, even as we're dealing with our religious friends today and they want to reference the signs of the times, the signs of the times are connected back here. This generation. It's when these things are going to happen. Now, so any thoughts, comments, questions on that before we move to the next part of verse 30? All right. And they shall see the Son of Man coming in the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. So the end of verse 29, moving to the end of verse 30, again is apocalyptic, prophetic language that the Jews are going to be used to hearing. This statement of seeing, not necessarily the Son of Man coming in the clouds of heaven with power and great glory, is found in Isaiah 34, and it's also found in Ezekiel chapter 32, verses 2 through 4. Ezekiel, yep, 32, verses 2 through 4.
Where's the Isaiah?
So Isaiah 34, oh, and there's also Isaiah 13. And these are they're all used in the same references in connection to judgment or warfare being brought upon other nations. So for example, one that I did not put in that list because I have it here in the PowerPoint, Isaiah 19. Isaiah 19 verse 1, the burden of Egypt, behold, the Lord rideth upon a swift cloud, and shall come into Egypt, and the idols of Egypt shall be moved at his presence, and the heart of Egypt shall melt in the midst of it. Now the question is, literally, because everybody wants to look at Matthew 24 and this sign of the Son of Man in heaven and him coming in the clouds of heaven with great glory and power, and everybody wants to look at that as literal. But yet, when I go through and I study my Bible and I see the same type of language being used, and it says, the Lord rideth upon a swift cloud, and he shall come into Egypt. Did the Lord literally go into Egypt at this time? No. This is Babylon coming in and waging war against Egypt. Now we know that this is how God operates because God describes Babylon, Assyria, Persia for that matter. He describes those different nations as his weapons of judgment by his own prophets. So the Lord isn't like, so when we're considering, and that's why these prophetic statements are being made, so that people do not just think, well, yeah, Babylon just came in and destroyed Egypt, and that's just because what nations do. No, no, no. This is being done by the hand of God. This is being prophesied. And that he is sending them in as a form of judgment. So Babylon is the one that actually did this. Babylon is the one that entered in, and Babylon is the one that destroyed. But they are doing that by God's design and by his judgment. So that when we're looking and we're studying this context and we're seeing the same language that's being used, yes, the Son of Man is involved in doing these things, but he's not doing it personally. It's Rome being used as the vehicle, being used as the weapon to bring about God's vengeance, to bring about God's wrath, correction, chastisement. So that helps us further in our Bible study as we're going through, and we have, for example, passages like Hebrews chapter 12 that tells us that whom the Lord loves, he chastens. Well, chastens how? Does he have to be the one literally doing it all the time? Or can he not use some other means in correction? Can he not use the church as being his correction? Absolutely he can. So as we're going through this and we're considering events, and so even with that we have to be careful that we're not viewing every event as though it's by the design of God, because that's also been dealt in this context already. What did Jesus say about wars and rumors of war, nations rising against nation?
Don't believe it.
But don't believe it in what connection?
Because they're going to be calling themselves Christ.
Okay. People are going to start looking at that in view of what's happening here, and they're going to say, oh, that's Christ. No, that's just life. That's everyday events. But here is something specific that Jesus pinpoints and says, now this, that's me. You don't get to treat that like everything else. All right, so any thoughts on that? Sign of the Son of Man in heaven, coming in the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. All right, verse 31. Now here's a fun one. And he shall send his angels with a great sound of a trumpet. They shall gather together his elect from the four winds, from one end of heaven to the other. Mark records this, Mark 13:27. And then shall he send his angels, and shall gather together his elect from the four winds, from the uttermost part of the earth to the uttermost part of heaven. Luke 21:28. And when these things begin to come to pass, then look up and lift up your heads, for your redemption draweth nigh. Now, the question that we need to ask ourselves is, here we have this description, and it's prophetic, it's apocalyptic, which, just like the Revelation, means we're dealing with signs and signifyings, symbols. He shall send his angels with a great sound of a trumpet. They shall gather together his elect from the four winds, from one end of heaven to the other. And then Luke tells us that this gathering together is a redemption that is drawing nigh. The question we need to ask ourselves is, what kind of redemption are we dealing with? Because this is not the only time where you find this kind of language being used. In Romans, I believe it's chapter 16, and memory serves right, I think it's 16:18. All right. So yeah, Romans 16, and we'll just start in 17 just for the sake of context. Now I beseech you, brethren, mark them which cause divisions and offenses contrary to the doctrine which ye have learned, and avoid them. For they that are such serve not our Lord Jesus Christ, but their own belly, and by good words and fair speeches deceive the hearts of the simple. For your obedience is come abroad unto all men. I am glad therefore on your behalf, but yet I would have you wise unto that which is good and simple concerning evil. And the God of peace shall bruise Satan under your feet shortly. The grace of our Lord Jesus Christ be with you. Amen. Now, that sounds like what other prophetic statement?
Genesis 3.
All right, sounds like Genesis 3. But now we have to ask ourselves, the bruising of Satan under your feet, and that shortly. Hasn't the bruising of Genesis 3 already taken place?
Jesus died and was resurrected.
When Jesus died and was buried and was resurrected. And that becoming a conqueror over death. So then the question has to be raised, what is this talking about? And is it talking about anything different?
You have the floor.
So when we are considering what's happening here, what's being described here, the temple is no longer the house of God, it's now the den of thieves. When you read John's gospel account, and Jesus is in discussion with the Jews, and he's trying to point to them the fact of why they're needing to listen to him and to step away from Moses. They get into a discussion about Abraham being their father, And then Jesus says, if Abraham were your father, you would believe me. But then you get all the way down to the end of that discussion, and who does Jesus say their father actually is?
Faith.
You are of your father the devil. Now, as we are viewing all of this transpire, we are seeing early on, before the church and the kingdom are even established, a divide is taking place between who the people of God are and who the people of Satan are. So as we are going through this and we're studying, and we are saying, just like with God, He uses nations to do His bidding. Doesn't Satan do the same? Okay. So when we are getting to Romans chapter 16 and verse 19 and 20, and the reference is being made in how the God of peace shall bruise Satan under, notice that, your feet shortly. So you see there, that's not Genesis 3. Because the foot that's going to bruise the head of Satan is who?
Jesus.
That's Christ. This is reference to the church. Your feet will bruise Satan. Bruise him how? When this takes place and Jerusalem is destroyed, Satan's agents, Satan's tools, Paul to the Corinthians, I believe it's in the 2 Corinthians letter, Satan has his ministers too.
So it would be the den of thieves.
Be the den of thieves. So even in the Revelation, John is told about a synagogue. Now you think synagogue, you think Jews. But who does that synagogue actually belong to? It's the synagogue of Satan. Those that were once God's people, and that they are rejecting Him. You're no longer God's, you're Satan's. You're His agents. You are His ministers. And thus, you're going to be put down. And with Paul writing to these Roman brethren, at this time, he's encouraging them of that hope. You're being tormented now. You're suffering now. But you, the peace of God, shall bruise Satan under your feet, and that shortly. So again, a time stamp. This isn't something far down the road. This is something at hand. This generation, your redemption draweth nigh. That's how we got off on that. So when we're referencing here to redemption drawing nigh, this is not a reference to spiritual salvation. They'll already have that. The gospel will be preached, starting at Jerusalem, that repentance and remission of sins should go forth in all the world, beginning at Jerusalem. They already have that. This redemption is in connection with this element, time of escape, being able to remove yourselves. Because there is going to be a church at Jerusalem. The apostles, for the longest time, are going to stay at Jerusalem. You need to pay attention. Your redemption, your time of escape, is closing in when you see these things to start happening. And so that, again, would be the job of the messengers. Shall send his angels with great sound of a trumpet. They shall gather together his elect from the four winds. Now again, that's another Old Testament typology. It's another Old Testament sign of coming judgment. Now it's used in different contexts. Now in the majority of the time, if you go back and you do a search on the four winds, it's in connection with a coming judgment. That the four winds are describing some stirring up that's taking place. but yet the elect are being gathered from this to where they would be taken away from it, and that from one end of heaven to the other. And that's what Jesus already said, that this gospel of the kingdom is going to all the world before these things start happening. So the messengers going out, gathering of the elect together, and that so as to remove them from this judgment, especially those that would have a desire to want to go back to Jerusalem so as to stay away. So when we're breaking down the language that's being used here, he shall send his angels. That does not necessitate a heavenly being. Angel just simply means a messenger. He will send his messengers, evangelists, the prophets, the apostles, so on and so forth. And that with a great sound of a trumpet. A trumpet, especially dealing with the tabernacle and the temple, dealt with a time of assembly. And we know it's also a cry of war. It's a warning that's being given out. The angels go out, the messengers go out, and that with the sound of a trumpet, warning people the spreading of this gospel, and they're gathering his elect. Those that are in the church, those of his kingdom, those that are washed in his blood, so that they are able to escape this great time of trouble that's going to end up coming upon them. Whoops. And, okay. And to illustrate this point, he then brings in a parable. So now learn a parable of the fig tree. When his branch is yet tender and putteth forth leaves, ye know that summer is nigh. So likewise, ye, when ye shall see all these things, know that it, American Standard Version has it translated, he is near, even at the door. And this is a parable describing, giving explanation of something that's already transpired. A miracle was performed dealing with the fig tree. Saw the green leaves, saw there was no fruit on it, cursed it, withered, and died. Then he went into Jerusalem. Now we have this same imagery being given about the nation, dealing with the parable of the fig tree. Okay, when you see the branches and it's tender and it puts forth fruit, it's put forth leaves, okay, you know something's coming. You know summer's approaching. Likewise ye, when ye shall see all these things, know that it is near. You can tell this is coming. There's no reason to be caught off guard. And that is even at the doors. Mark 13:28, now learn a parable of the fig tree. When her branch is yet tender, and putteth forth leaves, ye know that summer is near. So ye in like manner, when ye shall see these things come to pass, know that it is nigh, even at the doors. Judgment is near. And even in moving forward with these events, the reference to here, so here's Jesus, and who's he talking to in this context? All right, which ones? Peter, Andrew, James, and John. And he says to these apostles, so likewise ye, when ye shall see all these things. So he's just made a prophetic statement that at least those apostles are going to be alive to see this happen. And you're going to know that this judgment and these events are right on your doorstep. Luke records it this way, Luke 21:29. And he spake to them a parable, behold the fig tree and all the trees. And when they now shoot forth, ye see and know of your own selves that summer is now at hand. So this is similar to what Jesus said about the Pharisees back in Matthew 16, that you can see the sky at night and see that it's red and that everything's going to be well. Then you wake up in the morning and see the sky's red. No, it's not going to be a good day to sell. And he rebukes them for that. You can tell what's going to happen in the sky, but you can't see what's happening right in front of you. Thus Jesus again illustrates, and he says, look, you know how this works. You know that when it shoots forth, you see and know of your own selves that summer is now nigh at hand. So likewise ye, when you see these things come to pass, know ye that the kingdom of God is nigh at hand. That you'll be able to see this, you'll be able to view it, and you'll be able to make the proper connections. There's not going to be any doubt about it. So when I think about these kinds of statements being made, and then I think about all the different ones that have tried to make predictions in the past about, oh, yeah, this is the Lord's coming. He's right around the corner. And here's what we're looking at, and here's what we're seeing. And then they miss it. But yet here's Jesus speaking to this audience, and he says, you're not going to miss it. And when it came down to the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70, and you read, and especially when you read Josephus, and how he records it, and not only just the events surrounding the destruction of Jerusalem, but even everything that took place, all the battles that were fought throughout Palestine, from the north leading down and also coming up from the south, coming up from Egypt, the armies of Rome did. You see a lot of similarity to what was being prophesied as to what would happen, even in connecting some things over into the Revelation. You read what's being discussed in Revelation, and you actually read the actual events of the warfare during the time frame of those things, and there's a lot of similarity. So all these things, you know it's close. And yet we have people today saying, no, we're still waiting for this to happen. Is it close or is it still far away? Are they going to see it? Or is it something that we're going to see? Well, the next verse helps us with that. Verse 34, verily I say unto you, this generation shall not pass till all these things be fulfilled. Heaven and earth shall pass away, but my word shall not pass away. We're not in this generation. This is not for us. This is for them. And that these things will be fulfilled. And then Jesus stamps it even further by saying, heaven and earth shall pass away, but my word shall not pass away. These are not going to fall short. Now, what's interesting about this is that we have a section within our brotherhood that overemphasizes these events. Now, I know we're putting a whole lot of attention and a lot of emphasis on the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70, and that's just because that's what's being talked about here. So the destruction of Jerusalem was important, but it was not the end-all, be-all of the events of God. But we have a section throughout our brotherhood that are in realized eschatology, preterist, the AD 70 crowd, and they want to look at the destruction of Jerusalem. Well, that's when everything took place. Jesus came back. That's when the judgment took place. That's when the resurrection happened. And that's just it. Now, here's the thing. Here's the problem that they run into. The preterists actually end up putting themselves in a bottle because they then take away passages like 2 Peter 3, 10 through 11, 9 through 11. And they even make that about the destruction of Jerusalem and not the actual completion of time itself and the annihilation of this creation. The preterists actually go so far, and they have some similarity to the Jehovah's Witnesses, that this is just the earth's just going to keep going. And that's never going to stop. But yeah, what does Jesus say here? Jesus, in this overall discussion and in proving the fact of what he is saying is going to come true, Jesus states, heaven and earth shall pass away. This is going to end. And he uses that as a contrast to the fact of, but my word shall never pass away. So this is a major problem for the 80-70 crowd. And that's just a little side note of something that jumped out at me as we were dealing with this study. But even with what we're discussing here, and where Jesus is about to go, though these things have their application and their fulfillment at 80-70, and that we are witnessing judgment on the people and the nation of Israel and on Jerusalem, that does not mean that that is all. Because Jesus has more to say. And thus, he will end up transitioning. So, as he says, these things shall be fulfilled with this generation. These things happened. Titus destroyed Jerusalem in AD 70. And if memory serves me correctly from the studies that I've been doing, he actually was, he set siege to Jerusalem somewhere in the time frame of April, I believe it is. And Jerusalem was almost at full capacity because it was time of Passover. Once again, he knew when to strike. He knew when they would be there and what they would be doing. The temple, he completely destroyed the walled city. The temple, the buildings were thoroughly demolished. Josephus records specifically in a quote and saying there was left nothing to make those who had come thither believe it had ever been inhabited. So just as Jesus said it was going to happen, it did happen. And it happened in that time frame. But as we said, he's not done. But of that day and hour knoweth no man, no, not the angels of heaven, but my Father only. But as the days of Noah were, so shall also the coming of the Son of Man be. For as in the days that were before the flood, they were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage, until the day that Noah entered into the ark, and knew not until the flood came and took them all away. So shall also the coming of the Son of Man be. So we have similar terminology being used. Throughout the discussion of the destruction of Jerusalem, we have this reference to the coming of the Son of Man. The word but sets a contrast. We've been talking about one thing, but now we're talking about another. But of that day and hour knoweth no man, no, not the angels of heaven, but my Father only. Referencing the fact there are no signs. So we've gone from discussing all of these signs, and don't be caught off guard, to now there are no signs. It's not the same event. But as the days of Noah were, Noah and the events that transpired there, the days of Noah, was a preparation of judgment. 120 years waiting for judgment to happen. The judgment of Noah was not in a centralized location. That judgment was global. And it consumed the whole world. And even with what we have being described here, we can tell there are differences from what we've just talked about. For as in the days that were before the flood, they were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage until the day that Noah entered into the ark. So we have this contrast. We now go into a discussion of an event where there are no signs before anything takes place. Nobody knows anything. We've moved from local judgment now to universal judgment. And friends, brethren, when we're thinking about the things leading up to the destruction of Jerusalem, this is not going on. The Jews were not living their lives like everything was fine. Leading up to what we just talked about. Destruction of Jerusalem, the temple. Before Titus set siege to Jerusalem in AD 70, what was going on from, like, let's just round it all the way down. What was going on from AD 60 up to AD 70?
Nero burnt the cities.
Okay, you already have war and turmoil going on. Blaming the Christians for what was happening. But even consider this. Here's AD 67, AD 68. Vespasian and Titus are in their joint campaign together before Vespasian goes back to Rome to take the throne after the death of Nero. They march from Antioch, that's in the north, to put down revolts throughout Galilee. Northern tribes. And they're going from city to city, battlement to battlement, and they're putting down these revolts. Now, as we've already said in our previous studies, the Romans, which in their usual behavior are very strict. You make trouble and we've got to come in and put it down, we're going to make an example out of you. But as we discussed last time, there is a great deal of indignation between the Romans and the Jews because of how the Jews are acting. The Jews are being very treacherous in their dealings with the Romans. Remember, we discussed how Rome wanted to send a peace treaty, and the Jews said, fine, come in peace, and we give our word that nothing's going to happen to you. And then what do the Jews do? They betrayed them after giving their word that they would not. Now, the cities in Judea, that's in the south, learned of the coming army, not because of messengers, but because of the slain bodies floating down the Jordan River. You think that's a time where we're just, oh yeah, everything's fine. Go on about your business.
Well, they'd already been an occupied nation for quite some time under Roman rule, and the noose was just getting tightened and tightened through that history. You know, before that time, even when Jesus is talking and giving this, right then, it just went further and further downhill based upon the Jews pushing the limits
Yeah.
of the authority of the Romans, and so then their time was up.
Yeah, that's right. So even with the matter of the crucifixion of Christ, all of what you just described there was a part of it. The reason why Pilate went through with it is because, well, I don't want the Roman armies coming in here to put down this revolt. So they were already in that practice.
Paul too, when they were making a ruckus with
Right. Yeah.
Like,
Yeah, again with Paul. Yeah.
Can I just ask a question to clarify? So you're saying that Matthew 24:36 is kind of a transition or a pivot? Now
Yes.
it's no longer talking about 70 AD. Now it's talking about a generalized global.
Right.
Okay.
So when we're considering this judgment that's being pronounced earlier, it's Jerusalem, the Jews, but then you got to raise the question, well, okay, what happens to the rest of the evil people?
Right.
What happens to the rest of the people? So, like, for example, what's going to happen to Rome? We recognize as to everything that's happening to the people of God, to the church, Rome is just a puppet. And that who's really pulling the strings? It's the Jews. It wasn't Rome. Rome crucified Jesus, but why? It was the Jews. Now, does Rome get to skirt by and say, well, we were deceived, so on, so? No. Pilate knew he was an innocent man. Could have let him go. Jerusalem, the Jews, they're going to receive their punishment for what they did. Rome, you're going to receive punishment for what you did. So when we're considering these elements, yeah, this is dealing with a specific judgment. But then what about everybody else? That's when verse 36 comes into play. To where you have, just like with Noah, and you've got the whole world that lies in wickedness. The thoughts of their imaginations are on evil continuously. And God sends in the flood to take them out. So he says, and knew not until the flood came and took them all away, so shall also the coming of the Son of Man be. Now there were warnings during the time of Noah. Peter describes Noah as being a preacher of righteousness. He was warning them, but Noah didn't know when the flood was going to come. When did Noah know?
When God told him to come in and shut the door.
When God called him and shut the door. That's when he knew. And then when it started raining, that's when everybody else knew. So there weren't any signs leading up to that. Nothing to help you see, oh, this is getting close, we better get ready. We're in something different now. Now we're looking at when is going to be the judgment of all things. Verse 40. Then shall two be in the field, the one shall be taken, the other left. Two women shall be grinding at the mill, the one shall be taken, the other shall be left. This is still in connection with this. They knew it not until the flood came. And that here are people going on about their business, and the Lord comes and one's taken and one's left. So this is similar to the former as to what's already been discussed, of two persons sitting near to each other, and one's taken and one's left, and the separation that would be sudden, and the separation that would come. Just as Noah and his family were separated from the rest of the world, and that at the calling of God, come into the ark, and then they were transported out. The waters came and moved them from that place to a new place. And thus we see with this discussion, the days of Noah, here's how it is, here's what's going to happen. We now have a shift from talking about Judea to now looking inside of the kingdom. So earlier in Matthew 24, he's warning those that are in Judea, flee. So there's the location. Watch ye therefore, for ye know not what hour your Lord doth come. So now we're not looking into Jerusalem, we're looking into the people of God. Here you are, and you need to watch. But know this, that if a goodman of the house had known in what watch the thief would come, he would have watched and would not have suffered his house to be broken up. Therefore be ye also ready, for in such an hour as ye think not, the Son of Man cometh. And then he goes through the description of the householder with different servants inside of the house. He says the kingdom is like unto a householder. So we've moved from talking about Jerusalem and its judgment to now even we're looking at the church. And that the Lord is going to come and he's going to make a separation even inside of the church. There's going to be the wise servants, there's going to be the evil servants. And we studied that, we did it in sermon format as to how those servants are supposed to be. Now, even with this, let me see here. Let me make, we got one more slide here before I make an extra connection. Luke's account of this section that we're now studying. So as we said, we're trying to establish a shift or a pivot, as you mentioned. Luke helps us to do that. Take heed to yourselves, lest at any time your hearts be overcharged with surfeiting, serviceness, and drunkenness, and cares of this life, and so that day come upon you unawares. Now again, as we've studied, with all the signs that he's talked about, how could, if we're talking about the same thing, if we're still on the destruction of Jerusalem, how could they possibly be caught off guard? But yet he says to them, this can catch you off guard. For as a snare shall it come upon all them that dwell on the face of the whole earth. We've transitioned. We've transitioned from looking at those that are in Judea, flee, to now we're talking about everybody. And it amazes me that our brethren that are caught up in the 80-70 doctrine aren't making these kind of connections. That they, and I'm talking about individuals that have been preaching for years and years, and then they want to get to verse 36 and say, no, Jesus hasn't changed his discussion. He's still talking about the same thing. No, he has clearly changed his discussion. And in piecing it together with the other gospel accounts that give us a little bit more information, we find that is the case. For as a snare shall it come on all them that dwell on the face of the whole earth. Watch ye therefore, and pray always that you may be accounted worthy to escape all these things that shall come to pass, and to stand before the Son of Man. Shifting from Judea to the whole world, the judgment on the Jewish nation is in fact showing something that is also designed to come upon the whole world. If God would do that to His chosen people for generations and generations, then how could we possibly think that He would not do the same to us if we behave like them? If God is just and without partiality, if that is how God is going to treat the Jewish people, then He'd have to hold us to the same standard and the same level of accountability. So it's not just the wicked people and the evil people of Israel, but every wicked person is going to face judgment. And as the parable with the household and the wise servant, the evil servant, those are people in the same household. And yes, there will be evil people amongst God's people today. But God says, you're going to bind them up and cast them out. And actually in that parable, He says they're going to be cut asunder. With the parable of the 10 virgins, 5 wise, 5 foolish. Okay, you're going to have both as being the people of God. All right, the wise ones, when the bridegroom comes and He says enter, they're ready and they go in. But what happens to the 5 foolish? They're shut out of the door. And they're actually cast out into outer darkness. That's describing inside of God's people. Every righteous person, let me start that over. Every evil person will face judgment. And every righteous person will face judgment. And every evil person will receive condemnation in that judgment. But every righteous person will receive reward. Well done, my good and faithful servant. So there, Jesus is trying to illustrate to them, hey, yeah, this is going to happen in Jerusalem, but that's not the end. And even when you connect it back to, so this is what I wanted to mention just very quickly, when you tie Matthew 24 back into the parable of the wheat and the tares, you have a lot of the same terminology being used in that parable. I thought I had it in my notes, and now I can't find it. I thought it was 13, because that's where the whole list of parables are. All right, so yeah, back in Matthew 13:24, we're not going to go through it now because we're out of time. But just as we've gone through Matthew 24, you go back into Matthew 13 and verse 24 starting, and reread that parable of the wheat and the tares, and the explanation that Jesus gives to that, you see a lot of connection. Because Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are working as a transition. We've been under Judaism, we've been under the law of Moses, and the temple, and the Levites, and the priest, and the high priest, but now we are transitioning to this new covenant and to this new system. And you're going to have some individuals that are not going to be willing to give up of that system. And what are they going to do? They're going to play the part of the devil, when they should have been the first ones to transition and to go after the Messiah.
Incredible.
What is it?
Incredible that they didn't.
They didn't do it. And instead of being the allies that they should have been, they end up turning into his enemies. Then okay, we're shifting. We're shifting from Jerusalem, shifting from Israel. Now, it's the church. Now that doesn't mean, as you read throughout the book of Acts, and even especially in the Roman letter, just because this shift is taking place, that doesn't mean that God just now hates the Jews. All throughout the book of Acts, and as I said, you see it very heavily in the Roman letter, Paul was trying desperately to have his brethren of the flesh, his Israelite brethren, convert over. They just wouldn't do it. And as you go through the missionary journeys of Paul, his greatest adversary was not Rome. It was the Jews. They followed him from city to city, stirring up trouble. But then AD 70 comes in, and there's no doubt. There's no doubt when that event took place. And, the world is seeing it. We're still talking about it. That when that took place and all of those Jews, all those Israelites lost their lives, people knew it wasn't by chance. It was all because of fulfillment. Jesus said it would happen. Those faithful brethren that held true to what Jesus said, they got out. And they left. And the only ones that were there to slaughter and to massacre was the Jewish nation. Now, even as we're bringing chapter 24 to a close, even going into Matthew 25, we're still continuing the same conversation. We have two other parables that are going to be brought up, and a discussion about a separation that's going to take place at the end of that chapter. That's all in the same connection. So moving into chapter 25, that conversation has started here in 24:36. Now from a destruction local, judgment universal. And we've already dealt with 2 of those parables in our sermons. And we won't get into the 3rd parable today, right, Reese?
Yeah.
Okay. All right, just making sure. So we'll pick up at 25. I think it's 14. The parable of the talents.
14.
Yeah. Yeah, we'll pick up 25:14. Lord willing, next Sunday for our Bible class.